Hello, and welcome to the How We Do Digital Ministry podcast sponsored by Faith Growth. I'm your host, Charlotte Elia. And on this podcast, we talk to leaders who are out in the world engaging folks through digital ministry or chatting with folks about digital ministry and guiding folks through digital ministry. Today, I am delighted to have Professor Heidi Campbell with me. She teaches at Texas A&M University and is the author of at least 11 books and over 100 journal articles on digital media and religion. Professor Campbell, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I wonder if we could just start off, I feel so privileged that you're here, to kind of give us the view that you have sort of the current landscape where we are now. It's July 2022. Of the big issues that you see churches facing around this?
So, the last 3 years have been a very interesting journey, and I don't think anybody would have predicted that we would still be still in the pandemic as it was, in summer 2022. And so we've gone through a lot of interesting phases over the last few years. 2020, especially March 2020, was this time of kind of deer in the headlights. What is happening to us? And then I like to think of it as the season where many churches discovered the internet for the first time. Many churches that in the research that we're doing, they hadn't even thought about the need for Wi-Fi connections in their building, let alone having access to digital technology. And the furthest thing from their mind was doing services online. But for many churches, especially that were either digitally hesitant or resistant, we saw this kind of wave of innovation happening, even if it was kind of forced or reluctant innovation, as it were. And so from 2020 to 2021 was this kind of was a time of kind of I like to think of it back and forth kind of struggle of like experimenting, but kind of having failures, but also having successes, to being surprised at how well things worked, and then being surprised at how maybe the things and limits that social media didn't do. So we've kind of entered 2022, and at this point, we see kind of both. For many churches, online has become part of the package of resources that they offer as far as online services, and they've even started experimenting with how digital technology could be parts of other community building and ministry experiences. But in general, a lot of churches are kind of very burnt out, just from the exhaustion of the pandemic, and just, being in a season of change this long is exhausting for anyone. And so I think, we're still kind of in a wait and see mode of what the long-term impact of this season has been and the digital experimentation. But I'm excited for that people at least were forced into this experiment, even if it doesn't become part of their mainstream, that they've seen that they can do it. And a lot of people now have, and churches have, the resources that they didn't have 3 years ago.
Sure. You write in, where did I find this? This is, I think, one of the points to ponder from what should post-pandemic religion look like. 10 trends religious groups need to understand to survive and thrive in the next decade. But this idea that, as you're speaking here about change and adaptability and that huge shift we saw right at the beginning, March 2020, let's say. But this is the quote, if religious groups choose not to learn from the lessons of the pandemic about cultural adaptation and change, culture will not hesitate to leave religious institutions behind. Can you speak a little bit more to that and that threat there?
Yeah, I think, a lot of people, especially in the early days of the pandemic, saw especially this kind of the technology issue, or should we kind of embrace technology? It was a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity. And I think, those groups that were, these pastors that were willing to be open-minded or more positive about using technology, not only did they kind of get over the hump of kind of, the fear of technology, as well as like when things didn't fail, they didn't feel like it was the end of the world. So this having openness and being willing to be adaptable really kind of helped pastors and churches kind of do that problem solving, but see of it as an opportunity. And I think, we all know that, our mindset can directly reflect kind of how we see the world. And we always know, our outlook kind of guides kind of just the discourse of how we see the future. And so, trying to, instead of just seeing the pandemic as something that just like took a lot out of us, what could the gifts be? And what could the gift of this technology, given forced interaction, be for the church? I know a lot of churches have used this as space to not just think about, what their church services should look like, but also what is the nature of community and what is Christian community supposed to look like, as well as, what is the church meant to be like in this current moment? And, so I think that, it would be a shame for churches to miss that opportunity of reflection. And I know that the pastors that have been willing or given them space to go down those trails of reflection have found it a really rich and challenging space.
One of the things I think I most appreciate about your work is that you're thinking theologically about these issues, or at least getting to the why and not just stuck on the how and the what. So I'm wondering, as you brought up just now, even, I'm wondering what sorts of questions in that why category that you're seeing either just unanswered or maybe not as really addressed in congregation that are vital to continuing here.
Yeah, I have an interesting career. So like I started out as a kind of in media and actually working in journalism. And then I kind of, went into kind of corporate kind of group building and kind of problem solving consultation work. And then I went back to graduate school and I found myself in a PhD program in a theology school at the University of Edinburgh. So I've had this kind of dual identity of both a media scholar and a practitioner and as a critical reflectress. And I like to say that, I'm a media scholar that impersonates a theologian. And I'm finally at a place in my career now where I can actually go back to some of those theological roots. But there's a lot of kind of, there's still a lot of questions on my mind about, where are we going, the church? I mean, I was mentioning that I'm working on this research project, which is called the Tech in Churches During COVID-19 Project. And it's funded by the Lilly Endowment. And we've been tracking 2,700 churches in Indiana and how they made the digital transition during the pandemic and, what they learned from the opportunities and challenges that faced them with. And, one of the big concerns in 2021, and I'm still hearing it in 2022, was, will they come back? Even churches that have gone back to face-to-face or primary face-to-face services, there's a lot of people still missing from the pews. Some of that we know is because still of continued health concerns, especially older members or more vulnerable members of congregations, but also the online experience has given people a new option in which to engage in church. And so the concern is like, okay, did we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot by doing this grand digital experiment? Is it going to basically encourage this kind of consumer culture where people don't see, I have to engage in community, I can do church in a more individualistic way? Or is there something going on in the church before, and this just gave people an excuse to kind of move on out? And I think it's really a complex factor. It's it's easy to blame the internet, it's easy to blame the pandemic, it's easy to blame the circumstances. But I think there's a lot of social and cultural forces that the church has to reckon with. That maybe our model of church that's so event focused and time and space focused. That's kind of the predominant within the Western world. Maybe that hasn't been the best model, especially for longevity. And maybe switching to more a relational model is what's needed. And I think both technology can both help that as well as hurt that, depending on how you use the technology and set the technology up as a resource. So I think that the question of what is the future of the church, or who's going to be in the pews in 2 years' time, and in what ways can we kind of maybe culture the digital so that it actually encourages relationship and connectivity rather than just puts us more into an individualistic mode, I think is important to look at.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think a theme that I've noticed in some of your work, the recent work there, is of encouraging churches this sort of outward focus, right? That, and particularly going back to that March 2020 thing of I think you mentioned in a couple places, churches who say in their mission statement, we're all about outreach and these ministries, blah, 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 and then they go digital and it's just how do we deliver worship, right? And which is really an inward, it's for the people you already have, really trying to deliver that again. So I wonder, do you see particular opportunities, or are there people that are doing outward bound, let's say digital ministry and communication really well, models there that you would recommend?
Yeah, one of my favorite internet memes of the early days of the pandemic was it was an image from the movie Forrest Gump of him sitting on that bench, bus bench, and he said, and it says, and just like that, all the priests became televangelists. And there's this idea that when people thought about moving the service online, a lot of them had this really simplistic transfer kind of model. Okay, we're doing what we're doing in the church, but we'll just do it with the pastor and a few people and just put it out there. And if we do that, that will equate with the church experience. Well, people very quickly kind of saw, well, yeah, in some ways that actually makes me feel more disconnected, because I realize how this is there is no place for engagement that my face-to-face community had. So many churches kind of quickly over 2021, 22 saw that the transfer strategy or technique didn't really work. And so they moved into a translation mode of saying, okay, what things of a service can we do, online, and what things can't we do? One of the big debate areas was communion, and, for some denominations, they came down, well, we can do this in a certain, a spiritual communion kind of format. Others said, well, no, that's not going to work. But really saying, what can we do online? What are the limits of our theology as well as the practice? And then also saying, well, maybe we need to turn, the service into something else. I saw pastors do kind of fireside chat versions of services, or things where they just brought people into their study and kind of taught them as they would their own family, kids around the fireplace. Some people ended up with church services doing them, pastors in their living rooms. And while it's kind of, for some people, they're like, well, that just feels like a talk show, but it was really these experiments of how do we connect and create that kind of reciprocity and connection. The peaceful things I was most excited about in the early days of the pandemic, as well as kind of now, is those that really kind of moved on to what I call the transformation stage, where they're saying, okay, we're not just going to kind of broadcast what was on the offline version, and we're not just going to adapt it to the online culture and features, but we're really going to look at, what is the nature of church and nature of mission that we're called to, and then change not just the content or the holder, but also the practice as well. And so I think, some of the churches have kind of seen okay, how can we kind of, put some of the sermons online, but then create resources for people to do, for small groups to meet via Zoom and kind of engage with the sermon? Or how can we kind of create online prayer groups to maybe augment some of the less interaction that we have in our services? And so I think those churches that have been able to kind of go through those kind of different steps or been open to it, I think have come out in 2022 with a much more positive and a much more robust options for their congregations. The ones that kind of stuck in that kind of transfer strategy, they were the ones that quickly wanted to get back to face and have kind of forgotten the internet. But I think that's also a shame, after spending so much time, energy, and especially financial resources in many cases, buying cameras and tripods and getting things set up. Sure. So, my hope is that people see kind of this is basically one of the things in the toolbox of the church that needs to be engaged. It doesn't need to be the whole, but it shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, as well.
Yeah, I think you point out too this important issue of whether or not the church is on the internet, the congregates are, right. I mean, the people still are, and it's still a cultural milieu that is going to somehow be involved or impact the church, because it's impacting the folks in the pew, right?
Yeah, and that's I have two parents that are very much kind of digitally reluctant, and we're very slow to get on the internet and use digital media. But I used to tell them, even if you choose to opt out of having a smartphone or an email account, you're still being impacted and defined by digital culture. People's, are defining their relationships. They understand how people make connections and communicate through this space. And so if you choose to completely opt out, you're choosing to basically disengage with how people understand and live culture. And because there's a lot of our world, there's things that you can't now do face to face. You have to do the form online for certain government services and whatnot. And so if you choose to say, I'm not going to engage or just ignore digital media, you're really kind of saying, I'm not willing to engage with the contemporary culture in the moment I live in, as well as the culture that God has allowed to be created in this space and time. So it's I think missionally, it's very problematic.
Yeah.
Church websites are often outdated, difficult to use, and not very welcoming, and it can be hard for churches to keep up with the latest technology and trends. Website design is constantly changing, and most churches lag far behind the rest of the web. Faith Growth provides church websites that are easy to update, no maintenance, with a modern design that's welcoming to visitors. Our process helps create a website that's unique to you so you can reach the community near you. Schedule your free consultation at faithgrowth.com and see how we can help you reach your community.
You, as part of that digital culture, pointing toward this, the sharing economy, right, of the internet, and you bring up one of those points of ponder there with this work with Troy Shepard. But digital culture has embraced the notion of a sharing economy, yet religious groups have struggled to grasp collaboration or shared access and resources with other religious groups. What would a sharing economy look like if religious groups shared resources or offered support to each other? I'm bringing this up because it's something I've absolutely experienced, and particularly in that, beginning of 2020, and thinking, why are we all doing the exact same thing, right? and this thing that none of us actually know, not none, most of us have no idea what we are doing, right? And the efforts to collaboration just, at least in my area, never got anywhere. And I think also from other people looking out from outside in are going, I thought Christians were supposed to have all this stuff in common. And what is this Church of Acts activity? And going, oh, the church should have absolutely adapted to this. Why are these cultures so different? Why do you think there's resistance in church leadership to be more collaborative here?
Well, I think part of it's the culture. Unfortunately, there was a lot of reinventing the wheel, especially in 2020, of kind of, just like, and so I think especially a lot of, organizations, they just didn't have, in churches on an individual level really either had the infrastructure or desire to help people. So there was tons of examples of churches like, whether it was like setting up food pantries or working with local community resources. There was churches that I know that like opened up their, like they had already a production suite, like, hey, pastors can come in and use our suite and record their sermons and we'll help them out, or we'll loan you a camera for the next 6 months. And so there was a lot of that great kind of sharing in an individual level, but within denominations, it was very still inward focus. And that's because, do you see church as a community or church as an institution? And unfortunately, especially in times of instability, okay, we got to keep the doors open, everything afloat. And so we get kind of very insular focused. So, a lot of churches, it's like, okay, I'm going to help people in maybe my diocese or my network, but we just got to keep the lights on mentality. And that was really kind of showing this very kind of institutional focus versus churches that either already had a very kind of external, engagement with the community. They just kind of put, the digital into that. And they were willing to have more of, an open door policy and sharing policy. Because one thing we also saw is that the churches that had more of this institutional focus, if they did have kind of things that they did, it was all about keeping again the members of their community, which is important to do. But it was like, okay, let's help people in our network, but they never got beyond the front door, as it were. While other people, the churches that did have this, that more my kind of missional, social justice kind of thing, they just kind of kept doing what they had been doing and just added the digital element. I used to live until a month ago at an intersection where out of my bedroom window, I could see 3 different churches. And, during the pandemic, no one from any of those churches ever came by to check on people in the 5, condos where I lived, there was no, I was thinking, oh, maybe it'll be a visitor, or they'll stop by with a note or encourage to come to worship or something. But there was, and I knew where the pastors all lived. And I'm going, right. Is this really not right that this is the essential time when the church should be outward focused, and they weren't. It's not to say that churches aren't, but, I think, we have to get past this church as institution and really see it as a community, and not just the community of the people who come in our door, but the community in which we're situated in.
Do you think you're going to speak this church as institution issue here? As part of this digital culture is also an egalitarian movement and a decentralization. Um, whose church is it now, or in the digital space? Really, I mean, is it the denominations? Is it the person who I don't, the entrepreneur? What do you see there?
Well, I hope it's the church. The church is Christ.
Yeah, sure. Oh, sorry. I got to go back to children's sermon now. Yeah.
But I think it's again it seemed like what is the role? Is the role of the church to kind of just educate a specific group of people? Is it to run a set of programs? Is it to kind of gather people in connection on certain times or spaces? Or is it supposed to be like either a recharging station, for people to go out and then do the larger work of the community, of the Christian community? And I think, again, we've just fallen into this trap of this, we go in to do, religion has gotten relegated to a once a day week experience. And that if the church isn't doing the programming, then we don't see, oh, well, our church isn't doing that outreach, so I don't need to do that outreach. Mm-hmm. Or we outsource and say that leadership's doing that, and so I don't need to do that. And so there has become this real sense of the church is almost like a club. It's like something you kind of enroll and pay your dues, and then they do the work for you, mm-hmm. versus being part of a relational network. And so that's digital culture is kind of this too. There's aspects of digital culture that are very much built on that hierarchical model, even though it kind of looks like it's all egalitarian, sure. And it's about supporting structures. But there's also a part of it that's very relational focused. It's about these kind of loosely bound networks that you can create. And I think that if we embrace those aspects and use that as a kind of our model, that we can see using the technologies to create new types of gathering, new types of connection, and new types of relationship for people to impact their communities, their cities, the spaces where they live and work.
Very good. We are almost out of time. Aren't you relieved? I'm kidding. So I want to ask kind of one last question, one I guess last bit of wisdom you might share with us, and kind of is there one question or one thing, one activity, something pastors trying to discern this moment should be asking, or church leaders should be taking an inventory of, let's say?
Well, I go back to that portion of the Old Testament. I'm forgetting the reference right now, but it says, go to the crossroads and look for the ancient way and say, this is the way to walk in it. And, we can't get seduced by all the bells and whistles of digital technology. And digital technology, I think, is great. But, I think this has been a time of a wake up call for the church to say, who are we called to be? Not just for this moment, but just, in our tradition, and where maybe have we allowed our structures, our focus, our programs to lead us astray from that true kind of calling. Again, if the major concern is just keeping the lights on, that's not what the church was supposed to be about. Unfortunately, we've built this kind of really institutional rigid structure. But if our church, if the people, like I said, I'm just thinking of the church across the street, if the people across the street don't even know what you're doing in that building and have never had any connection with you, are you really being the church? No, you're just being a stop-off filling station, but you're not really being the church in your community. So I guess that would be my challenge, to say, can we use this as a moment to reflect on where we're called to be, and how either close or far we've come to that calling.
Excellent. That is what a great charge for us to end on there. Thank you. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. Where do you want to be found online?
Well, I'm very Googleable, but one website I would point you to is my personal research website, HeidiCampbell.com. And it's there that I have a kind of a whole page of called e-resources, where some of these ebooks, free ebooks and e-reports that I and my research team have put together, but really aimed at kind of getting the information, translating it from academic ease to a broad audience, and then also trying to get it in people's hands as a helpful resource. So that's where I would think. You can also find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, but that would be where I would be first port of call.
Excellent. Thank you. Those are really wonderful resources. Yeah, even I could understand them. But I think made well too for potential studies with lay groups or groups of church leaders too. So really highly recommend those. So drheidicampbell.com, right?
Yes.
So thanks again. Thank you, everybody listening. We want to invite you all to join our private Facebook group, How We Do Digital Ministry. That link is in the show notes, as well as links to Professor Campbell's webpage. That Facebook group is a great place to join with colleagues to discuss all things digital ministry. We can further the discussion on these questions that we spoke about today. But until next week, peace and blessings to you all.